Good evening and welcome. I am Mary Elizabeth Halper. I am the inaugural Dean of the Humanities at Hertog program, and I am just thrilled that tonight I get to talk about one of my favorite works of literature, the Homeric epic poem, the Iliad. And my ostensible excuse for getting to have this conversation tonight is that I'll be teaching a seminar on this book, on the recent celebrated verse translation of the Iliad by Emily Wilson. That seminar is going to be running in March and April, and the application deadline for it is tomorrow. So if you have an application waiting in the wings, or if you know someone who really should take this class, really nudge them, or go ahead and finish up that application. But tonight is a kind of foretaste of the kind of conversations I'm really looking forward to having in a couple weeks. And I'm joined for this conversation on the Iliad with, I'm joined by Dr. Emily Austin, who is an assistant professor of classics and the college at the University of Chicago, where she's been since 2016. She got her PhD in classics at Boston University, writing a dissertation on the Iliad. And before that, she got her degree in classics, her BA in classics from the University of Dallas. And that's where I first heard of Emily. Perhaps the most curmudgeonly and best professor I ever had, Dr. Carl Maurer, spoke of Emily to us. And Dr. Maurer was not one for lavish or even moderate praise. So when he said to us as young classic students, "Oh, Emily Austin really knows her Greek," we knew it was something special. So again, I'm just thrilled that I get to talk about this poem that we both read in our freshman years and have kept reading and talk about it with her this evening. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So I think I'd like to start with something that you've spent some time working on. Your first book, titled "Grief and the Hero: The Futility of Longing in the Iliad." And so in that book, you talk about emotions, you talk about longing, and in particular, emotions and desire, in particular, grief and longing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'd like to start just sort of hearing about why that was a topic that was interesting to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a sort of particular question that I want, a particular moment of emotion and desire.
Sure. So, yeah, I think that my way into, it's really hard to find your way into the Homeric poems. Not hard, maybe just as a joyful, happy reader, but like to find a research topic because they're so worked on. Like I heard a statistic, something like there's 200 things published on Homer every year or something like insane. And so I did take quite a while to find my way in, but I think the reason it landed on emotions is I was interested in like the human dimension of this plot, which actually I think is a trend, a 20th, 21st century trend, moving away from thinking about fate and the gods and towards thinking about humans, which is something I'm grappling with, that I'm participating in this. But I like the plot of the Iliad is so spiraling and so big and so hard to get a handle on. But thinking about like why are these characters acting the way they're acting? What's motivating them? That I kept coming back to that, trying to understand almost decision making, but from this sort of emotional or interpersonal angle. And Homeric poetry is not like what people would call psychological. It's not, and it almost never tells you like so and so did something because he was angry. It's rare and unusual and exciting when the poet tells you like what was motivating someone when they did something. So it also made it an exercise in close reading, which I really like doing, trying to just tease out from what happens, what's going on in the characters. So, and then with Achilles in particular, he just really dominates the last fourth of the poem, and um, I became in my book, before my book, interested in what's going on with the relationship between grief and anger. Why does the loss of his companion and friend Patroclus make him want to kill people? Like, I think that seems really intuitive to us, but actually it's not intuitive. And the fact that the Iliad never tells you why anything happens made me ask this kind of basic human question again. So I don't know. I'm sure I'd give you a different answer every time you ask, but that's an answer.
Great. Well, so you mentioned the person that I want to ask about, or the character that I want to
Yeah.
ask about, and that's Patroclus.
Yeah.
The there's a moment in this relationship between Achilles and Patroclus where
Yeah.
Patroclus just can't sort of hold back anymore about how he feels about what Achilles has done, taking himself out of the fighting.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder, Achilles like sends him to go check on the people who have
Yeah.
been wounded in the fighting that's taken a turn for the
Yeah.
worse for the Greeks since
Yeah.
Achilles has left.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if Achilles sort of knew what he was getting into. But I really want to ask about Patroclus and what is it that sort of pushes him over the edge? Like,
Yeah.
he desires to get back into the fighting so much so he begs Achilles. I think Achilles calls him like a sniveling little girl or
Mhm.
something like that because
Mhm.
he's so distraught at not being
Mhm.
in the fighting.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering, yeah, what's going on behind
Mhm.
that desire that manages to
Yeah.
persuade Achilles to
Um,
not only let him get back in the fighting, but give him his armor to get back
yeah.
into the fighting? What's
Yeah.
the emotion there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do have a student who wants to do his dissertation on Patroclus as a distinct character because most of the work on Patroclus tends to be on Achilles and Patroclus together. So I'm very interested that you have this question because I've been thinking about it with this student. Yeah, in some ways, I think at least in book 11, when Achilles sends Patroclus in to find out who's been wounded, he seems to me to represent this side of Achilles that's not active in the Iliad, but that we know is there. That Achilles who's capable of pity, of healing. Like we know from book 6, Andromache says that he had reverence or a healthy sense of shame and buried her father in his armor. Just really extraordinary to not keep the armor and to bury someone you were fighting against. And we know from book 21 that Achilles used to spare suppliants. And we know that there's an Achilles who's not the Achilles that we see in Iliad. And so sometimes I think about Patroclus and I'm like, Patroclus shows us the Achilles we don't see in Iliad. But you're right, as Patroclus gets involved with the Greek army, he becomes more than just an extension of Achilles, like an extension of Achilles' pity or his side that knows how to heal or all these things. And he becomes someone who's able to reprimand Achilles and get Achilles to do what he wants. But I haven't really thought about what's motivating Patroclus in that. I mean, what the text says is that he is so distraught. Wait, I mean, the reason I say he's Achilles' pity is when he sees the wounded Greeks, he's very distraught and he pities them. And the crying in book 16 is like a deep frustration that this friend that he's so close with is allowing people that he cares about to die. Achilles cares about them, and he accuses him of being inhuman, and so I think there's a kind of indignation motivating him, not just pity for the Greeks who are dying, but frustration with Achilles for being cold and not maybe the best version of himself, we might say. And when he goes in, he does very much think about Achilles' honor. When he goes into battle, he thinks about like he says to all the Myrmidons, "Let's win honor for Achilles." And I mean, and you mentioned like that turning point. So I mean, there's a few turning points. There's the turning point of getting stuck, healing. Then there's the turning point of getting snapped out of it by seeing that the Greek ships, are really under danger, and that he really needs to get Achilles to do something. And then there's the turning point of after Achilles agrees to send him in, and Patroclus fights, of continuing to push
Yeah.
up to the wall. You look like you wanted to say something. Yeah,
I want to ask about that moment. There's so when Kelly sends him out, he says, "Don't go too far.
yeah,
You and I together, we
yeah,
are going to take those Trojan walls down."
yeah, yeah,
And it's always been a mystery to me.
yeah,
At some point, we don't get to hear the
yeah,
internal decision making process, but
yeah,
at some point, Patroclus, I guess, decides to, or ends up neglecting, or
yeah,
maybe it just gets caught up. I'm not
yeah,
sure,
yeah,
but that kind of I don't know. I really liked how you said that he thinks Achilles is not being his best self, and that
yeah,
strikes me as like a way of feeling sad for a friend
yeah,
when they're not doing what you know they're capable of doing.
yeah,
But then when he's on the battlefield,
Yeah.
I'm not sure he's thinking about Achilles anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
he's becoming too much like Achilles to
Yeah.
get Achilles inside.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't, that's a good question, whether he's thinking about Achilles. I mean, he does say as he's dying, um, Hector totally misinterprets the relationship and the motivations there and says like, um, um, basically like Achilles, I forget what Hector says, but like, do you remember Achilles must not care about you, or um, too bad you were here alone, or something, and which is really not what's going on. Yeah, let's look at it. We have our texts.
Yes,
Are you looking at Emily Wilson?
I am.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm at Lattimore here. Um, Patroclus, you thought perhaps of devastating our city and stripping from the Trojan women the day of their liberty. Fool. Achilles, though he great as he was, yeah, this is the line I was thinking of, could do nothing to help you when he stayed behind and you went. He must have said to you, don't come back until you've killed Hector, which is the exact opposite of what
Right.
Achilles said. Um, I I think Patroclus, to some degree, what's going on in book 6 has to do with fate and the gods. Which isn't really satisfying if we're talking about emotions, but it's like the flip side of what I said. But so something that happens with the narrators, I'm sure you remember, but it keeps addressing Patroclus in the second person throughout book 16. He keeps talking to him as a you. And at that moment where he pushes too far, I think he calls him a nepios, a foolish, almost like a foolish child, like someone who has delusional hopes. And so the pushing too far, it probably has something to do with the battle fury and the battle excellence and getting caught up in it. I think initially he stays fighting because he really is trying to save the ships. But and I don't know if you know the play and Iliad. It's a one man version of the Iliad that obviously is very condensed. It's like an hour and a half version of the Iliad, and they play it like Patroclus is in a battle fury. So I might be influenced by that he's, yeah, like you said, becoming Achilles. It's not best self or something. But it's also like they do need to sack Troy. I mean, like, I don't know how much he's really thinking about it. Like, he doesn't know what Zeus is planning. Zeus is planning on having him die so that Achilles will come back, and maybe he just really has this moment where he thinks he could take the city.
Yeah. And I think even if he is thinking about himself and his own glory there, I still, maybe I also am having a hard time separating Patroclus from Achilles, because I have to wonder too if he's thinking that now Achilles will really see me. Like I wonder if that calling him a sniveling little girl.
Yeah. He was carrying that. It's like, I'm not a girl. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I do wonder, because he's clearly second fiddle. I mean, everyone is second fiddle to Achilles, but he's the closest second fiddle. That must be a very tough position to be in when one's worth is so thoroughly determined by the glory that they get, their prowess in battle.
Right. And what gets appealed to by Nestor in book 11 is this idea that Achilles needs Patroclus too. That when they went off to battle, the fathers gave both of them advice, and Achilles was given the advice to remember that he's not that great at thinking things through, and that he should listen to Patroclus, who's older and a little bit wiser. And so whether or not that really shaped the relationship, it's interesting that it gets appealed to as Patroclus is getting set off on this like path of entering battle by himself.
So this kind of leads into another set of questions that topic that I'm interested in, which is which is the role of the domestics. That so much of the poem is on the battlefield. The bulk of the poem is on the battlefield, which makes those moments not on the battlefield, or where there's moments of respite, all the more interesting, I think. So I'm curious about the domestic that's happening on the margins here. Most clearly in Troy, but I think there's some really interesting moments on the Greek side as well, including some moments with Patroclus. everyone sort of he's got this healing
Mhm.
role that he plays, but then I think
Mhm.
Briseis says something after he is
Mhm.
dead about how he would sort of take care of
It's
everybody,
gentle, yeah,
gentle.
yeah, yeah, everyone says
Um,
he was gentle.
but if we
Um,
think about the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles as not wholly determined by
mhm,
their role as commander or second in command,
mhm,
but as a
mhm,
genuine friendship,
mhm,
this sort of leads me to ask about
mhm,
maybe the domestic versus the
mhm,
martial. I mean, he
mhm,
was a guest friend. Patroclus
uh-huh,
was a guest friend of Achilles' household.
mhm.
Uh, so
Well, yeah, he's guess what? He's kind of like an exile, right? So that's a really interesting
you
theme is the exiles or the people who've murdered someone who are taken into a household. Yeah. I mean, something I've been thinking about lately is how yeah, it's that a lot of the I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but that some of these bonds seem like they don't have like clearly cut categories that they fall into. So, um I think you're right that there is a kind of distinction between what you see on the battlefield and what you see on home at home. But I'm also interested in moments where what's going on domestically or non-martially is brought into the battlefield. So you're right, it does happen more with Troy. Like there's a wonderful scene in book 8 where Hector is thinking about Andromache feeding his horses. And he's on the battlefield and he's thinking about Andromache. And it's about Andromache, not just Andromache's home weaving for me, but Andromache's feeding the horses that I fight with. So this blending. I think for Hector, it's very acute, the blending of domestic and martial, because if he dies, the city will fall. And the
yeah
city is made up of families. And so that blending becomes, but I think you're right that we can see it, you know, to some degree we can distinguish between them. Achilles is a very different kind of hero from Hector because his family is far away and I think some of the intensity of grief with Patroclus is like bound up with not having your family there. So like all of this non-martial friendship, whatever, is represented by one person. There's an author who writes about have you heard of this book, Achilles in Vietnam by Jonathan Shea? So he's a psychiatrist who
yes
um, reads, maps Achilles's battle theory onto the PTSD. Well, he maps it onto what Vietnam warriors in a berserker state went through, and then and kind of compares these. Um, and he has a line where he says, like, when you're fighting abroad, your buddies are everything for you. They're your parents, they're your children, they're your best friends, they're your spouse, they're everything. And but what's so interesting to me is that's what Andromache says to Hector. She says, you're not just my husband, you're my father, you're my siblings. Like I've lost everything. So what happens to these characters who are really sort of unnaturally isolated from all these relationships and then forge new ones? It's something it seems like Patroclus is really special about is the helping people, well, at least Briseis and but other warriors say it too, but helping people experience something that maybe they're missing in the context in which they're in. And that's what Helen says about Hector. He says, like, everyone looked at me like I was the worst, but you were kind to me, and at his funeral.
yeah
So it's not a good answer. I think there's a lot of blending. But there's a lot of blending in a way that makes you think about what might be particular to the motives or to the experiences of different people also.
yeah one moment of blending on the Trojan side, which like there are many more examples on the Trojan side. They're fighting at home, they're fighting for their home, so it makes sense that the domestic and the martial will have a
Yeah,
lot more
that's right.
crossover. But after Hector's death, uh, Hecuba, his mother, has an extremely violent
Yeah.
reaction.
Yeah.
I think something about eating the spleen
Mhm,
of Achilles.
mhm,
She wants to eviscerate
mhm,
Achilles, and of course
mhm,
Priam goes almost in the opposite direction. I'm not sure if
mhm,
it's a different way of eviscerating
mhm,
Achilles what Priam actually does, but it certainly is a more it's a less violent approach. What Priam
mhm.
goes and clasps his knees, clasps his hands, and
Yeah.
begs to have his son's body back.
Yeah.
Tender almost. Um,
Yeah.
So I wonder about this blending, this mixing. If there's a way that it actually flip
Yeah.
flops, you would
Yeah.
would expect something more tender
Yeah.
out of the mother,
Yeah.
who's been
Yeah.
at home. But here she is, ready to
Yeah.
dive into the bloody battlefield if needs be, and then Priam, who sneaks
Yeah.
sneaks into the
Yeah.
tent
Yeah.
and begs. So
Yeah.
yeah, is that one of these
Blending. I mean,
blending?
yeah, I love that. I mean, in general, so many people work on the Iliad in terms of gender that I try to think about different categories and see what happens. And that's a wonderful example of this, where it's like, if you want to say that men are all about vengeance, like, just look at the speech of Hecuba. Although I suppose what people really do say is like the women sort of push for the vengeance and the men execute it or something like that. But um Priam's never looking for vengeance. He even in 22, when his reaction's pretty violent in a certain sense, he's ready to go out on the battlefield instantly when Hector dies. And the Trojans are holding him back because we'll just kill him on the spot at that moment. And so you have this doubling of 22 and 24 where um Priam tries again, but this time with the help of the gods, with the prepping that has been done of Thetis to Achilles, and then like this, yeah, really moving scene where he kisses the hands of the man who killed his son, and is he appears like an exile, like
Yeah.
someone who needs to be taken in. So, but Hecuba, yeah, I mean, it's violent, and the only people who talk like this, or for whom language of eating raw flesh comes up are Zeus accuses Hera of being like this. That Hera will only be satisfied if she devours her enemies raw. Um, and then Achilles wishes he was angry enough
That's
to
right.
eat Hector's body raw. And then Hecuba says this. And what Hecuba says about it, this is in my book. She says that those would be deeds of a vengeance that's like of balanced worth, if she could do that. And so I think she's stuck in this paradigm that Achilles is stuck in of like, how do you make up for this loss? Like, eating Achilles' liver is not actually going to make up for the loss, but she uses this language of balance and reciprocity. And Priam breaks the paradigm totally. And that's what kind of brings things to a different place.
Yeah, that the scene of him showing up, um,
Yeah.
like an exile showing up in the house of a rich man. I love that the flipping that seems to happen there.
Crazy.
Priam does not have blood on his hands.
Yeah.
Achilles does.
Yeah.
Priam is the rich man who has the home right
Yeah.
there. But in the simile, it's
Yeah.
Achilles' tent is the house of the rich
Yeah.
man. It's a
It's so
wonderful.
cool. Yeah.
It's yeah, and it's a beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful simile. It's a beautiful moment, a very intimate, tender,
Yeah.
tender moment.
Yes.
And I think that, so this is sort of my last set of questions before we turn to some of the questions from the audience. And so I forgot to mention at the beginning, just dove right in, and now
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
was so good. I forgot to say, if you have questions for Dr. Austin about the Iliad, please do put them in the question and answer box, and we'll be happy to talk about them some more. But I want to ask about not only this moment, which I think is one of the most heartbreaking moments, beautiful moments. But there's these little snippets of incredibly tender beauty where you feel you feel that I can't keep using the word tenderness. You feel
Mhm.
the sensitivity of the
Mhm.
poet. One
Mhm.
of them that really struck me recently was when Helen is looking. We first see Helen; she's surveying the Greeks. She's sort of giving some background information on everyone, giving their sort of dossier
Mhm.
to Priam and the Trojan elders. And she's looking for Castor and Pollux. And the poet is just sort of an aside, says she didn't know they were already dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
get the poet sort of setting you up as a reader
Mhm.
to have this moment of a sadness of tender feeling
Mhm.
not given to the characters. And he does this a lot with similes as well as beautiful moments, contrasted with moments of great violence. And that if you were to be in front of someone whose bowels were flung out along the sand, or whose head has been mostly lopped off,
Mm.
so it sort of droops, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, how beautiful. But when you're reading it with
Yeah.
the poetry, yeah, you have these
Yeah.
moments of, oh, how beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I guess I want to ask about sort of the emotions, maybe the reader,
Yeah.
in the reading these book, reading about something that's so intensely
Yeah.
silent,
Yeah.
but also so
Yeah.
ravishingly beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sure it'll come up in your class too, because you're thinking about translation. Because some translators lean into the violent, trying to get the sense across that this is a war, and some translators are trying to lean into like this is poetry, or I mean, poetry can lean into the violence too, but leaning into kind of order and transcendence. And um, my feeling is that part of what's going on is that the poet of the Iliad is he doesn't want to just come out and say war is bad. He wants to depict a bunch of situations and a bunch of realities that have really, really intense consequences, but he's never heavy-handed. Just in the same way he doesn't tell you like what the emotional motivations are usually. He doesn't tell us, gosh, this was violent and terrible. He's juxtaposing things all the time. Um and so I think, I mean, if it's right to say that the poetics of the Iliad juxtaposes violence and beauty and doesn't help you sort through it, I think that's intentional, because I think part of the meaning of the Iliad is like, it's not simple. It's not like the Greeks were right or the Trojans were right or Achilles was right or Patroclus was right, or, you know, wouldn't it be, or even like we didn't talk about Agamemnon and Menelaus, but like mostly I hate Agamemnon. But then you have these moments where he's just like he's being a good big brother, and that's really why he's there. Maybe I don't know. And he has a really poignant lament when Menelaus is wounded, and it would be too simple to hate Agamemnon. I think that's something that Iliad does really well. So this is not simple. It's not easy. Being human is really difficult. And then on top of that, you have the gods and fate and narrative. And so by confronting us with this experience of, I don't know if horror is too strong, but of like alarm and distress and um unsolvable problems, and then like nestling in them, there's like a completely stunning simile or something. I think that part of the poetics of that is like forcing us to engage in a lot of like quietness as interpreters, and a lot of like openness, and like because you have like one perspective and then it's immediately flipped. I mean, in the battle books you don't even know who anyone is. Um, like who's on what side, um, and it's a sort of this abundance of people and stories and humanity, and I think the meaning of it is somewhere in that tension. But I don't know. I might change my mind. I'm sure Emily Wilson has different things to say about it.
So I'm supposed to be feeling uncomfortable when I have my breath sort of taken away by a beautiful image, which
I
is
don't know if you're in the moment you're uncomfortable, but that the meaning making process that you engage with as you're going along is not tidy. That you you move from like these are men around a corpse to these are flies in a milk pail, and what comes out of that maybe is uncomfortable because it's not tidy. Like it's much easier when things are clearly good or bad. Maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
yeah, I think I'm trying to resist the push towards good and bad. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there's I don't know, I have a lot of Play-Doh in my rear view mirror. or I should say Plato's hovering over my thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, he was
And
really
so
nervous
I have
about
this question
yeah.
of beauty and the good. Is it good and beautiful? How do they put
Yeah.
together? But I actually I think I'm more my my initial question is just at the level or in terms of the beautiful and the ugly. And so not so much because I want to like render a moral judgment about
Yeah.
whether it's good or bad for this man's head to
Yeah.
be nearly cut off, but um,
Is it beautiful or is it ugly?
yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like there I don't yeah, it's an untidy answer.
Mhm.
Uh I think in some ways really want to cling to the idea that poetry is essentially about order.
Mhm.
Um but yeah, given your answer, like maybe I should think more about whether
Mhm.
there's a sort of a special untidiness
Mhm.
that a poet can deploy or needs to
Yeah.
reckon with.
I mean, it was a very violent world, right? So I don't think the original audience is, um, surprised by that, but I do wonder if they're surprised by it being depicted in, like, really stunningly beautiful poetry. I mean, just it's so much better in Greek than in English, you know? And, yeah, I don't know what they would have experienced on that level.
Oh. Well, okay, I will be done. I'm going to be done asking all of my special questions. So, because I get to have this opportunity sooner rather than later to
Yeah.
talk at more length about them. So I'm going to turn it over to some of the questions that we're getting from our audience. This one comes from Tessa Brubaker, and she asks, "What role do the emotions of the gods play in the poem?" And she says, "I'm specifically thinking about Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Do you think that they operate the same or differently than those of the humans?"
Ooh, um, I mean, that's a great question. So, I think the only difference between gods and humans in the Iliad are dying and not dying. So, my instinct is that the emotions basically work the same way, except insofar as emotions are different if you do or don't die. I think that's the only basic difference. So, like, um, there's no sense that the gods have to be better than us or anything. So Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, this lust for the sack of, or sorry, Hera and Athena's lust for the sack of Troy, Aphrodite's sort of all-in defense of Paris. It's petty, um, and I don't. I think the reason why there's been a push away from thinking about the gods relative to humans is like we're just so uncomfortable with gods being petty. But I think the Iliad is presenting that pettiness of having to do with not having that consequence of death be something that's as personally felt. Um, so in terms of like what I specifically look at with grief and anger with Achilles, those are the way grief gives rise to like a vengeance that can't be satisfied has a lot to do with death specifically. So it is a good question I should think more about. Like, how is Athena and Hera's desire for vengeance? Because that's a desire for vengeance that's spurred by like an insult. It's more like Achilles in book one. And what might you make of thinking of like them more like Achilles in book one and not participating at all in this arc? Um, I think Zeus thinks they're pretty pathetic. He's always trying to needle them and rile them up. Um,
Do you think that Zeus's plan, his agreement, or his I guess his silent assent to Thetis? Not no, it's not silent. He does say it, but there's that moment where he's
mhm.
reflecting. Do you think that's an emotional moment for Zeus when he agrees to go through with all of this at Thetis's request?
Hmm. Um, maybe. I mean, he's disturbed. The Greek says he's disturbed. I think he's disturbed because of how momentous what he's considering is. I think Zeus is the one who's the least petty, even though he's like incredibly obnoxious. I think he's pretty aware of the stakes. Well, he's presented as being aware of the stakes of what's going on. Um, but I have no idea what he's deciding to do about. Like, is it just what she's asking for? Is it the moment where he really decides how he's gonna accomplish the sack of Troy? Like, what is he thinking about? It's we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there's a lot we don't know in the
Yeah.
Iliad. That's fun to think about.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so this question comes from Sade Nayo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. On the subject of reciprocity, I was hoping you could expand on the vengeance slash revenge present in the wrath slash grief displayed in the epic. In some ways, it reminds me of the justice as vengeance present in Hamlet.
Hmm. Oh, yeah. Hamlet. Um, yes. So I think there's a narrative or a thing that people say in the Iliad where they say that killing somebody will either balance out the maybe lost honor of the death of a comrade or will assuage the grief over the death of that comrade, either for the person or for the parents. There's this idea that if someone kills my friend and I kill that person, I've accomplished something healing or restorative. That's a thread. And I think what's going on with the Achilles story is that the poet of the Iliad is saying, like, does that really make sense? Because with the grief of death, what you've lost is completely irrecoverable. And Achilles, in all his extremity and like being super over the top, I think he exposes this strange structure of vengeance seeking, where um, what's motivating the vengeance seeking is the loss of a person who's not brought back by the vengeance seeking. So Achilles is, sorry, by the vengeance seeking. So Achilles is cycles of grief and anger, especially in 24, where it becomes a literal cycle, is representing this. And this, I call it futility. But you're right. Like, there's a whole other way of thinking about vengeance that's in terms of a kind of justice or um and what's interesting is the people who are mad at Achilles, so uh Ajax in book 9 and Apollo in book 24, they both say like we have ways of dealing with this as a society. Society deals with murder or these like even if it's the murder of a kinsman with gift of like a repayment, a poine. There's structures in place to deal with this. And Achilles says basically his actions say those structures are not actually sufficient because they're not addressing that root cause. So what I think is special in book 24 is that we move away from a sense of balance to a sense of that what's going on is release. So it's not that Prime gave Achilles something to make up for the death, but that Prime's presence literally caused a release in Achilles. It's a different kind of logic.
Okay, yeah. So he's able to let go. I mean, is that a kind of growth on Achilles' end? I mean, the comparison to Hamlet is really interesting to see. I think you're wondering whether Hamlet is actually changing or growing or
Yeah, I
and
know.
it's
I
really
know.
true. And yeah, is this a moment of maturing or I'm not even sure if maturing is the
Yeah,
right way to think about it
yeah,
for Achilles, but does he change? I
yeah,
mean, he gives up the body, he lets go, but is
yeah.
that a
It might be a little bit of a change. I mean, he gives he gives Priam advice that seems to be based on his experience. I mean, it's really ridiculous. I mean, he's like, "You shouldn't weep forever because there's nothing's accomplished by weeping forever." And it's like, "Okay, Achilles, like, um, what have you been doing?" So,
projecting much?
yeah, yeah. So, and then the whole Niobe story in 24, I don't know if growth is the right word. I think he's in a different place obviously than he was. And in some ways it's a little bit like where he was before Patroclus dies, but in other ways it's not. So whether we want to think about that growth, maybe not, but there's something I think that Achilles has always been capable of certain kind of, some people have called it magnanimity. There's something he's always been capable of, like, that's activated by Priam, which is this ability to really like kind of imagine himself from the outside or see what he's doing to Troy. Um, Giving Priam those 12 days to have the funeral for Hector, that's a lot, but like the Achilles who buried Aetion in his armor. But it's more magnificent because the loss of Patroclus was so devastating. So maybe growth. I'll go with maybe growth.
I'm afraid I stepped on a question from one of our audience. I didn't see it until I was asking you, but Kelly Kwan was asking about this magical moment. I like that phrasing of empathy shared with Priam, made up whether that made up for Achilles' loss and rage. But I wonder. It sounds like you're saying not empathy. He doesn't. It's not like he's feeling alongside Priam, but he's like taking this as an occasion to be. I mean, is it the same kind of magnanimity that let him always let Agamemnon have the biggest spoils?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the thing is, we just don't know what happened. I mean, obviously we don't know, but I don't have a reading on it, and it's such a puzzle. They weep in parallel, but for distinct reasons.
Yeah.
So I think there's something deeply human about this, where it's like, okay, when you are going through a loss, it's a particular loss. So Priam's loss of Hector is Priam's loss of Hector, and Achilles' loss of Patroclus is his loss of Patroclus. And so that's where I don't quite think it's empathy. There's a deep isolation in these experiences, but they are doing it also together. The Greek like dances between the dual and the singular and the plural, and but I don't know that we know why it happens. Just like we don't know why we ever, like, I don't know, let's say I'm in a depression and I come out of it. It's not like I can identify the cause, right? But it is the moment, and the Greek says Priam stirred up in him a desire to weep for his father, and the longing, it doesn't say longing for lament, but that's what's understood. And the longing left his body and his spirit. So that's why I call it release. I don't know that we know the full cause, but it left. And that's why I'm nervous. Like, how do I attribute it, or who do I give the cause to? Because the verb is passive. You know what I mean? Like, it left. It's not like Achilles let go, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's I mean, that right there is a hard problem about agency.
Yeah.
It's something,
Especially when you're talking about emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, something is taken from you. At some point you let it go. Or are you actually?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I want to ask a question about sort of shifting a little bit.
Sure.
To a question that we got from Kyle McKenzie about speeches, because and speaking in assemblies particularly, but I'm thinking about the way that at some point it seems like Priam tries to persuade Achilles to give up the body, like recalling Achilles' father to himself, and saying, like, think about the way that your father would mourn you, and Achilles shuts it down. And then but they still manage to have this moment, and it works. He gets Priam gets Hector's body back, but it doesn't seem like it works because Priam like marshaled a really
said the right things. Yeah,
rhetorical argument.
I totally agree. Yeah.
But Kyle McKenzie asks, sort of in book 1, 490, Lattimore translates, but that other sat still in anger beside his swift ships, Peleus' son, divinely born, Achilles of the swift feet. Never now would he go to assemblies where men win glory, never more into battle, but continued to waste his heart out. And Mr. McKenzie here is curious about the glory that people win in assemblies. Similar or different from the glory that's won on the battlefield. I'll just throw in to Mr. McKenzie's fine passage here, but also when we see Achilles in the embassy scene, Achilles is sitting beside his ship after sort of, I guess, coming to terms with what he's decided. He's playing the lyre, right? He's singing some poetry.
Yeah. I think that the glory you win in assembly is lesser than the glory you win in battle in the Iliad, but it's still definitely a way of winning glory. It's like it's what Nestor has now, right? All those long speeches. It's Nestor's. Nestor can't fight anymore, but he can have this role. And it's also, we were talking about this earlier earlier in our conversation. It's what Patroclus brings to the relationship, that
Yeah.
excellence in speaking. So I would say it is maybe it is of the same kind, but it's not of the same scope or degree. But then there's a kind of deeper level of the question, which is Achilles misses both in that scene in book one. I love that scene in book one, where it's like he's the one he left, but he's yearning for what he has left. And that's the same longing word that I'm tracing actually in Grief and the Heroes, that yearning. And that's the kind of yearning he has for Patroclus when Patroclus dies. So it is part of the identity of these warriors, not only to fight, but to be in assembly. So that makes me think about community, right? So when you win glory in battle, do you win it by yourself or do you win it as part of a larger community? And when you win glory in the assembly, it seems to me that's not really like you just gave some sort of spectacular speech and everyone's like, wow, great job, right? That there's some sort of communal dimension to it. And so to what degree are these heroes to be thought of as solitary, and to what degree are they in community? And the deep hurt for Achilles in book one that he brings up in book 9, when Ajax gives the shortest speech and the speech that gets Achilles the closest to giving in. But what he says is, I was treated like an immigrant. I was treated like an outsider, someone with no honor. And then he says that again to Patroclus in book 16. And this idea that the community has pushed me out. And so I think speeches maybe have a special role in that bond, because a speech only works if someone understands you. So in thinking about these heroes as, interpersonal or having a communal dimension. Although I suppose the glory won in battle is only real if it's recognized by the gifts of the whole community too. So that's where the glory won in battle has that communal dimension too. But then the other thing I'll say, let's see if I'm talking too long, is that wait, what was the last thing you said? The embassy scene.
Yeah.
The singing the Andron. Yeah, with the lyre. So yeah, so that's a weird scene, because is he singing to Patroclus or is he singing to himself and Patroclus is just sitting there? And what has he come to?
Yeah, he doesn't seem as nearly as shaken about being kicked out of the community. But I also wonder, it's like the closest we come to having a poet in the story, this moment with Achilles. And I wonder if there's like a possibility. Is there just like the very rarest hint of a possibility that there's another form of glory besides the assembly in the battlefield? There's a form of poetic glory.
Yeah. Oh yeah, probably. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, there's probably, I mean, the verb is he's delighting his thumos.
Yeah.
He's having a great time by himself singing. Even though he's still deeply angry and the speeches bringing it up again, it's not that book one yearning. He's contentedly delighting his heart with these songs. And they're the songs about the glories of men. So I have read this as him, that what he says to Odysseus then in book 9, where he's really rethinking all of the terms of his life. I have read that as coming out of whatever he's been doing and singing and thinking about. But yeah, Homer doesn't tell us.
Yeah. It also just reminds me of a poetic moment, or one of the moments of Achilles describing how he relates to anger, giving the simile that it's sweeter than honey.
Yeah.
But also thick as smoke.
Yeah. Crazy simile. Yeah. I love that.
Okay. Let's see. We have quite a good bit of questions here. I'm going to ask you this one from Jerry Zhu. The war was participated in by thousands and millions of people. The poem focuses on just a small percentage of them. Do you think Homer considered to develop the emotions of the unnamed and unknown soldiers and the civilians during this war when writing this? We get a lot of names, we get
Yeah.
a catalog of
Yeah.
ships and who all came in, but
Yeah.
um, these beautiful moments of seeing
Yeah.
a particular warrior die,
Yeah.
he gets a very particular simile, but
Yeah.
there is
Is
lots
he still
of
elite?
fun.
Yeah. Um, yeah, how the warfare in the Iliad actually worked is hard for me to parse out. Some people think that the warriors that we think of as elite are actually in the group, and they only become elite when they sort of dart out front and have a little skirmish and then they go back. So in that sense, yeah, when we get I love the death narratives and I mean just these little glimpses of who these people were and the lives that they had before this moment. So when we get those, maybe it is a little bit of an everyman, and, that's the feeling I get, but I think it's still a valid point, like, there is absolutely another way to read this, and there's evidence in the text to read it like this, that there's the mass, and then there's the protoi, and so the question is, are the protoi are the ones out front when they come in and out of the mass, or is there always this distinction? And, but I it seems to me that Homer's instinct is to identify the value of smallness. That's why you get a death narrative. That's why you get a simile. And I mean, I think he's absolutely like aristocratic and uh, but that's the instinct, that's the impulse of the poem to think about this interplay between small and big. And you have that in the Shield of Achilles, where these fine details are surrounded by the sun and the moon and the stars and the ocean. It's like, am I Zeus? Do I have this huge kind of scary vision of everything? Or am I here in the intimate details of a particular life?
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder about the opening sentence, causing the Greeks immeasurable pain, had
Yeah.
sent so many noble souls of heroes to
Yeah.
Hades, and made men the spoil of dogs. She translates autus as men,
Yeah.
the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds.
Yeah.
I, that those heron, those heroes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they are just the I mean, I'm not sure
Yeah.
they are just the ones that go
Yeah.
out in front skirmishing back. It
Yeah.
seems like everyone who dies because of this,
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
this plan of Zeus, because of the rage of Achilles,
Yeah.
all of them, it seems like in the opening,
Yeah.
all of them are heroes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I think that's right. Yeah, hero is anyone who's fighting at Troy. And on the other side, like in Troy, Andromache's lament for Hector has these nice movements where she goes from particular to general too, where she talks about, and Priam does this too, like all the generic, I don't mean in a bad way, but like the women in general whose children will be orphans and who have lost their husbands, and the movement between, because you have to follow some characters, but the movement between particular names and general seems to me to be um, suggesting their relationship and their likeness. I think.
Yeah, I really want to just repeat something that you said before. So I personally don't forget about the value of small things.
Mhm.
For yeah, this it might be it might be easy to forget that when you're reading an
Mhm.
epic
Mhm.
poem. But I think it's really
Yeah.
right and raw and wise.
Yeah.
Uh, so we have some more questions about psychological depth and this ability to imagine himself on the outside, Achilles' ability to imagine himself on
Yeah.
the outside. But we also have a question about Achilles and Odysseus and the Iliad versus the Odyssey. Are you up for talking a little bit about
Sure.
that? Going a little off
The
program.
other poem.
The other
Um,
poem. Yes. I mean, I think it's still on theme here. This is from
yeah.
Carrie Balden. Dr. Austin spoke of the absence of psychology in Homer. He says, I'm not fresh on the Iliad, but I just read the Odyssey. At the beginning of it, Telemachus receives counsel and explanation from Athena and his companions. But by the time he returns to Ithaca, he acts of his own accord, and his recent maturation even causes Odysseus in disguise to be moved. Here, the psychologizing recedes as Telemachus becomes more self-sufficient, less in need of instruction and decision making. So, what change in psychological depth do we see? He asks about Achilles in particular, but I wonder if there's anybody changing in the Iliad.
Iliad to
Um,
Odyssey. I mean, I think where Achilles does recognize something important is in book 18 of the Iliad, where he says that he was a useless burden on the ground because he didn't help anybody in his time of not fighting. I think that's a moment of recognition. And I think it's more significant even than Hector. Hector has a similar moment in book 22 when they're begging him to go inside the wall and he stays outside and he's like, I can't face the people inside because they told me to go in and now I've lost all these men. So I think there's moments of recognition and growth. Yeah, I think it's true. You can track it with Odysseus pretty clearly because he's at least one of the sharpest examples. I don't know if he's the only example, but one of the sharpest examples I can think of someone in a Homeric poem saying like, I learned something. So he says
yeah.
when his servant women are sleeping with the suitors, he's super angry. He wants to kill them on the spot. He tells his heart, like, you endured worse things in the Cyclops, in the cave of the Cyclops. And so the idea is like, I've grown from this experience. I guess what I mean by lack of psychological depth is that the poetics are not always attributing or displaying it. It's like you have to tease it out from what happens or from how something is told. And and sometimes accused of like treating the Homeric poems like novels, right? I mean, they're not novels. They're very, very different genres where, I mean, it's deeply contested, like what even all these words for chest mean and how it all holds together. And um, so, but it could be the case that a poem about homecoming might be particularly suited to displaying a certain kind of growth or maturation. Definitely seems to be part of what Odysseus needs to go through, part of what Telemachus has to go through, like you to leave and come back and be a different person. Odysseus in the beginning of book 5 of the Odyssey, he was just sitting on the shore weeping, right? And to move from that to the man who's going to just kill all the suitors when he gets home, like there's a transition at least. But in terms of the actual poet's way of talking about why people do things, I don't know if I would. I mean, one probably could. I don't, off the top of my head, have a strong feeling that the Odyssey has a different psychological vocabulary or something than the Iliad, or a different way of using its vocabulary. But it is certainly a different poem. I mean, obviously it's a different poem, but it has different interests as a poem.
Yeah, I wonder. Minister Walden here asked sort of another Plato reference.
Yeah.
Plato's judgment on these two characters, Odysseus for his versatility and Achilles for his simplicity. And it's true, he is the polytropos, Odysseus is. And the thing that we just get one thing about Achilles, at least in the prologue, namely his rage.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like from this conversation, I feel like we can say like pretty firmly that rage is not simple.
Mm-mm.
That is it's a complexity.
Yeah.
It's not just a.
Yeah. No, Achilles is very, very, very complex. I think maybe a way in which you could say he's simple is like he's committed to what he thinks at any point in time, even if he's changed. So it's like this totalizing. Being with Achilles is like would probably be horrible because there's this total, like there's no black and white. It's just everything all together. And yeah, I think there's some German scholar who says something like that. Like when Achilles has made a decision, it's like his identity. But I think when you mentioned Karl Maurer when you were introducing me, and when I told him I was working on a dissertation on Achilles' emotions, he basically told me I was a fool. He was like, yeah, like a strange and dangerous character. Like, why would you touch him and try to say anything about it?
Oh, he was worried for your soul, huh?
Yes, Dr. Mao was worried for my soul.
Oh, well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Emily, Dr. Austin. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I was already really excited about talking about the Iliad again, but now I'm at least several times over more excited.
I'm so glad. Yeah, it was a
Uh,
pleasure.
Good. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you for all the wonderful questions.
Yeah,
And like I said, if you haven't finished that application, or if you know somebody who would really like to read the Iliad, get them to submit an application. The application's closed tomorrow. Thanks again, Emily. Have a great evening. Good night, all.
bye.